Taking away the guns in New Zealand, will it really make people safer? And migrants are angry pretty much everywhere. Coming up on today's Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, Chuck Holton here. Italian police have evicted migrants and others from an abandoned former school on Rome's outskirts in the latest operation to empty occupied buildings of all these squatters that they're having problems with. Residents weren't happy about that, and they set fire early Monday morning to mattresses and other garbage to form a barrier and prevent the riot police from entering the building. But authorities doused the blaze and proceeded with the eviction. Interior Minister Matteo Salvini, who we talked about last week on the podcast, has championed a crackdown on migrants and said Italy has no tolerance for anyone who illegally occupies abandoned buildings. He also said the structure was dangerous and put women and children living there at risk. City Hall officials say they were providing alternative housing for the nearly 200 people affected, but that didn't stop them from trying to set the neighborhood on fire. Good for them, I guess. In Paris, also, illegal African migrants are demanding the same rights as French citizens now and recently occupied the Pantheon. Police in Paris have removed scores of people who invaded the famed monument where many famous French figures are buried in order to press their demands for residence papers. Police moved into the monument hours after Friday's occupation began and evacuated the occupiers who are illegally living in France and demanding a meeting with Prime Minister Edouard Philippe. Some members of the group identified themselves on Facebook as Black Vests. You're probably familiar with the Yellow Vest movement that's been tearing up Paris and other cities around France for literally weeks and weeks. I mean, it's been several months now. And they also are included members of a group that called themselves La Chapelle Debout. That's a reference to the sector in northern Paris that I've actually visited that's teeming with migrants that are basically homeless. They make shelters under bridges and that sort of thing. Of course, when they were denied all these demands, they set up the all too familiar cry of racist. You couldn't have guessed that one and seen that coming, could you? Both at home and around the world, we're seeing that word used against anybody who stands for the rule of law. In Paris, look, the government there doesn't care what race these lawbreakers are. They only have a problem with the fact that these men are breaking the law. And when did it become racist to expect people to abide by the rules of the country? I don't know, but it's happening as well here in the States. President Trump's getting lots of flack for his decidedly unpresidential Twitter habit, not wholly undeserved, mind you. In my opinion, the best thing he could do for his 2020 chances would be to give up his Twitter account altogether. Nevertheless, he's really being pilloried by the left for a new rule that will require migrants to claim asylum in the first country they enter after leaving their own, though I'm sure some Ninth Circuit Court judge is going to strike that down as soon as possible and also call that racist. You know, when you think about that, requiring these migrants to claim asylum in the first country they come to after leaving their home country, it really makes a lot of sense. I know we say that Mexico is very dangerous, and there are parts of Mexico that are, but it really comes down to about 5 cities in Mexico where almost all of the violence occurs. I know, I went and lived in Mexico, and you know, you can go most places across that country and be very, very safe. It's the same thing in Guatemala. It's even the same in Honduras. If people are leaving Honduras because their neighborhoods are dangerous, they can go to other neighborhoods in Honduras that are not so dangerous and live just fine. If they don't like that, they can go to Guatemala, and there are plenty of places in Guatemala where they can live safely. And people in the states on the left like to make the argument that, well, it's not safe enough. Well, how safe is safe enough? What are you talking about? Like Baltimore safe? Chicago safe? Miami safe? How safe does it need to be before they can stop? Well, essentially, the left is saying the only safe place on earth is the United States of America. That's obviously not true. Well, let's talk about New Zealand, another very safe place. They just completed their first gun buyback since the horrific mosque shootings back in March, which left 51 people dead and another 49 wounded. Now, New Zealand is not a hot zone. It's, on the contrary, normally one of the safest places on earth. Now, I hope you'll indulge me as I point out how what's happening there since the shooting is not going to make that or any other country any safer than it was before. If anything, it's probably make the people there in more danger. New laws went into place there recently that restricted the kind of weapons that were used in the mosque shooting and told people to turn them in mandatory buyback programs. The government has set aside millions of dollars to buy back these weapons, and if my arithmetic is right, they're paying about $1,500 per gun or more for the very few firearms that are being turned in. Now, you need to understand a few things about New Zealand. Number one, they have a very, very homogenous society. So pretty much everybody has the same morals, values, and worldview. So if they decide to make changes to their country's laws, it's a pretty easy and straightforward process. Also, the country is so safe that the idea of firearms for self-defense is basically unheard of. Still, a gun buyback is probably the least effective way of making the country's citizens safer. I mean, really, who can imagine criminals turning in their weapons? Normally, the people who turn in guns at buyback programs are those who inherited them and don't want them, or could use the cash for whatever other reason, sometimes just to buy other better guns. Listen to some of those who were involved in the buyback and hear what they have to say.
Yeah, I didn't want to, obviously, but it wasn't an heirloom, it wasn't an antique, it was just a firearm that I can go and get another one with the right size magazine tube and be legal.
The law changed, and I can understand, it makes everyone feel safer, so yeah.
You've got to remember this law change doesn't make people bad who've got these firearms. They're good New Zealanders. It's about us encouraging them to come in and partake in the process during the 6-month period so that we actually honour the intent behind the legislation.
Now, it's clear listening to these guys that New Zealanders have a different mindset when it comes to firearms than most gun owners in the United States. Liberals here, like former presidential hopeful Eric Swalwell, have been advocating for massive compulsory buybacks in the United States, and the results have been so underwhelming as to be downright ridiculous. Liberals aren't just attacking the Second Amendment, they want to fundamentally transform the very culture that has made America exceptional for most of our history. Excuse me while I rant a little. The deep hatred that progressives have for American values continues to rear its ugly head in just so many places, and it's really disgusting. The left has become more and more unhinged as they fulminate under the Trump administration. Everything Trump says or does is one more log on the fire of their hatred. I've often said America is really two different countries with vastly different values trying to inhabit the same space. And you only have to look at the news on any given day to get a sense of just how mutually exclusive these two groups of people can be. If you feel like everything you've ever known to be good and honorable and just is now being called terrorist and deplorable and corrupt, you're not alone. Look, I spend a lot of time overseas. And I see firsthand what it's like for people living in countries like Germany and Austria, where you're literally prohibited from defending yourself. You can basically just expect to simply lay down and die if you get attacked, if there don't happen to be any police around. And I've also been to Sweden, where you can be arrested for having an opinion that the government deems to be unkind. I've been to Honduras, where if you're robbed, the last place you go is to the police, unless, of course, you want to be robbed again. I've also been to Somalia several times, home of a certain congresswoman who loves to hate on America, where the only law there is that of whichever warlord can bring the most terror and suffering on the people. And believe me, that's not a place you want to live. Somalia is one of the worst places on the planet. And Somalia is looking to hold its first real elections in 50 years in 2020. And that's a big deal because it's been a failed state for nearly all of living memory. I was there when they rewrote the Constitution and was pleasantly surprised to see that they were committed to enshrining the right of the people to defend themselves. But when you see how lawless that country truly is, you can understand why people come from places like that to, say, Italy or elsewhere in Europe, and then they're likely to attack and destroy when things don't go their way. The rule of law is one of the most important factors in a stable civilization, however. And you have to only spend a day in Mogadishu to get a real appreciation for that. So this is what I don't understand about Ilhan Omar. She seems to be vehemently against those very parts of American civilization, the American authority, whether it's Border Patrol or the Pentagon. She's always attacking them. Here she is attacking the Department of Defense for dropping bombs on al-Shabaab terrorists.
In Africa. And, you know, we oftentimes are really dealing with this issue, and it seems like we are attempting to drone it to death. And I'm just wondering what the particular assessment has been, because we know that in Somalia, particularly in dealing with al-Shabaab, since President Trump has gotten elected, the number of drones have increased, but the number of attacks that al-Shabaab has been able to carry out has also tripled. We also know the same to be true for Boko Haram, and I'm just wondering where do we go from here, and what the solution really should be.
Thank you for your question. I just know the Department of Defense employs a broad spectrum of activities and engagements across the continent. Our direct strikes is actually a very small component of what we do. I noted earlier in my discussion, the testimony, we work on building partnership capacity. We do security cooperation, training and equipping, but also working to employ medical expertise, as well as women, peace and security, and so forth. So it's really a broad spectrum of what we do. In the case of Somalia, we also have a broad approach, which we have building the Danab, which is an advanced infantry brigade, in order to provide security for people in Somalia, high level of protection. We've seen great results from that. We also work as a coordinating function in order to ensure international donors' contributions are being used as effectively without duplication as they can. In the case of our strikes, I would say that we take ultimate extraordinary lengths to ensure that we reduce any kind of civilian harm, and that we're working in coordination with our partners, to include the federal government of Somalia, to ensure that it is in line with what their broader approach is on a full spectrum of economic, political, and so forth. We're trying to maintain pressure on the network in order that we can create that time and space. And we have seen some improvements in Somalia, as we've noted before, just some of the economic reforms that are ongoing. We've seen the Somalis take greater responsibility as far as joint operations.
Now, here the police and the military are held to a very high standard of integrity. And while justice might not be perfect, it's so much better than the rest of the world that most Americans can't even imagine the kind of corruption that's very common elsewhere. So where is the benefit to our country for representatives who grandstand like this? One of the signs of this enormous divide in American culture is how literally everything becomes politicized. This has created a socially toxic environment where people can't even stand to be in the same room with somebody who holds a different view than they do, where employers are feeling pressured to stand politically on every issue, from abortion to guns to same-sex marriage. This is not what a healthy culture looks like. In a saner and more civil time, back when I was a kid, people tried to get along with others out of a common sense of simply being American. They used to say, hey, it's a free country, when you saw some guy being weird or whatever. And they let people believe whatever they wanted. But then the left decided that America didn't have problems. America was the problem. This depraved worldview made them become the very things they accused America of being. They accuse America of racism while forming racially exclusive hate groups. They accuse America of fascism while using fascist tactics to violently oppose anyone with whom they disagree. And they accuse you and I, members of the other side, of literally murdering children with the fact that we stand up for the Second Amendment. So one thing's for sure, the left's hate-filled worldview has no room for one thing, and that's irony. All right, I'm stepping down off my soapbox now. I try not to indulge my opinion too terribly often on the podcast, but the events of the past few days and the absolutely vile rhetoric being served up by both sides of the aisle makes me think maybe we need to step back a bit and just reflect on how truly exceptional are these United States of America. All right, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for being here. I know I always ask you to like and share the podcast, but really, please like and share the podcast, because you doing so could just make the difference in this thing really taking off. And I'd appreciate it. All right. I'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for being a part of the Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.